Well, it's so good to be with all of you again for studying the book of Acts. We're studying in Acts chapter 24, and last time we got about through the first 3 verses or so of Paul's defense before Felix. Before we enter into this time of study, we want to begin with a word of prayer. We'll ask Brother Brody to direct our minds. Amen. All right, so we've got Paul's trial before Felix in this section while Paul's in prison at Caesarea, and then he'll preach to Felix and Drusilla on another occasion, and then he has a trial before Festus. That is, left the S out of Festus there. Festus. In his trial when he becomes governor, and then Paul's defense between King Agrippa. Where Paul's going to appeal, or he appeals to Caesar before Festus. Just read through the first few verses of the trial that we looked at last week. We had the opening statement by Tertullus, who is the Jewish leaders, their lawyer that they've hired for the Roman court, and he's buttering up Governor Felix with flattery. It says, and after 5 days the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with a certain attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. So here's their start of their appeal here to the governor to condemn Paul. And after Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation. So he tells, oh, what a great governor he is. He's brought so much peace. All of this is just flattery. None of it's true. He's not brought peace, and he hasn't, through his great governance, brought great reforms to people. It says, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us, by your kindness, a brief hearing. So, I don't want to wear you out. I could just go on and on talking about your greatness, but let's get to the case. And so he begins to lay forth then the charges, and again talks about this governor is so kind and mild and gentle and sweet and reasonable. But he's not any of those things in reality. The Jews are all going to go to Caesar Nero to try to get him kicked out because he's been so cruel and bloodthirsty as a leader and so greedy, trying to steal everybody's property. But anyway, he says, we hope that you'll indulge us in our argument. So here are the charges that they bring against the Apostle Paul. It says, for we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. So there's their charges. They say he is a pest. The word pest there means a pestilent fellow, a plague. We have some people that think about Christianity that way today, don't they? They think we're just a disease that ruins all of their great utopian plans about everything, because we condemn sin. That's the way they looked at Paul. He was just a plague. It was going all through the Roman world, teaching the gospel and causing trouble among the Jewish people. He just stirs up dissension, and there's riots everywhere he goes. Well, we've studied a lot of those riots and things. It wasn't Paul that stirred up the riots, was it? It was after there were a lot of people converted, the opposition, those that weren't converted, decided to stir up the mobs, right? It was the other way around. But that's what their charge is. It says he's a troublemaker. He causes disturbances of the peace that the Roman Empire should condemn. He's done it everywhere, and now he's doing it here. He is a ringleader. That's the only place in the Bible that term is used. He stands in first rank. He is the chief champion and leader of the Nazarenes. That's a new term for Christianity, and instead of the gospel, or they say it's the Nazarenes. That's who these Christians are. They follow this Jesus of Nazareth. So they're the Nazarenes. It's a military word. It stands first in the army. He's the standard bearer. Man. Paul is out there in front leading the parade of these Christians in causing trouble. And they need to cut the head off here, get rid of Paul. It's really a praise in our eyes, I hope, so, that Paul, man, what a life he led, that he is considered the ringleader of Christianity, that he's out spreading the gospel everywhere. So they're really in a charge there. This sect of the Nazarenes, they seem to be accusing Paul of founding a new religion, that he's gone off from Judaism, and now he's teaching this new thing. And of course, any new religion was outlawed by the Romans. You had to have, your religion needed to be recognized by the state of Rome to be valid. And they had recognized Judaism as a religion. And they're trying to say he's teaching something different. He's teaching an illegal religion. So it's a danger not only to Paul, what they're saying here, but to every Christian everywhere. If they say the gospel's not lawful to be taught in Rome, he calls Paul and the Christians there a sect. Heresis is where the word we get heresy from. It's a body of men following their own tenets. But they had different sects among the Pharisees. They had the Sadducees and the Pharisees and Essenes, different groups. And now they say now Paul's teaching the Nazarene way. The Christians, they're an offshoot. They're a sect. So then the final charge, which those Jews from Asia had falsely accused Paul of taking Trophimus into the temple. They said, now he's tried to defile the temple by taking a Gentile in there. And we arrested him. Is that the way it happened? They just said, there's that Paul, let's get the police to arrest him and we'll have a trial. No, it was a mob that attacked him and we're going to kill him right on the spot. And the Romans had to come in and save him, is what happened. So we had a completely different situation than is presented there. So, and then this statement is made by Tertullus. He says, and we wanted to judge him according to our law, but Lysias the commander came along and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. In the New American Standard, you notice those brackets that are around those verses there? In the oldest manuscripts that we have, that verse isn't there. So that's an indication. Again, we have 5,000 Greek manuscripts, handwritten copies of the New Testament. And there's some of them that have, a lot of the younger ones, I guess maybe even the majority, have this verse in there. But the oldest ones that have been found don't have it. So it's thought maybe it was a note, maybe that got added into the text that someone had put in there. That everything that's stated there is true, that's what happened. So it's one of those, disputed passages. But you can see it doesn't have anything to do with our salvation, does it? Doesn't have anything to do with that. It's just a further explanation about what the Jews were intending to do. And here it says that they even are accusing Lysias that he came down there and saved Paul. Right? It's everybody's fault but theirs, right? That this situation has arisen. It's Paul's fault. And now it's Lysias's fault that he came down there. And he used a lot of police brutality when he took Paul away from him. With much violence, he took Paul. So doesn't this sound like something you could read in the paper today? See on the evening news? It's all their fault. It's all a total overreaction on their part. Much violence. We were going to give him a fair trial. Well, that wasn't what was happening at all. And then he concludes, and by examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you will be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him. And the Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. So He doesn't offer much evidence, does he? He just makes a lot of charges. And that way it is a lot of times. People load the charges up, but there's actually, when you look at it, there's not any evidence to back it up. They charge a lot of things. He throws it over to the governor like, now if you'll investigate it, you'll find out what we're saying is true. Well, they're supposed to prove what they say is true, right? That's what they're in court for. You don't say, now if the judge will do his job, he'll get all of the facts to condemn Paul. No, that's not how justice is supposed to work. They're supposed to bring the charges. They're the prosecutors here. So again, they're just a bunch of law-abiding citizens doing their duty, and this Paul is a pest and a problem, and he needs to be stopped. And what's sad is all of the high priest and the elders that came from the council of the Jews, they jump right in on these false charges. They put their reputation behind things that just aren't true. Lysias already wrote a letter to the governor and told him that they were having a riot, and he went down and saved Paul because he was a Roman citizen, right? And got him out of their hands. So, but they endorsed this lie that's been offered up. So they're all involved in it. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul responded. So the Apostle Paul now gets his turn to speak. And he is going to answer every charge that they made. You're going to take them boom, 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 and show that what they say is not true, that the facts don't support what they're saying. And he starts off by talking about how pleased he is to present this before Felix, but he doesn't have all the flattery and over-the-top praise of this ruler that the Jewish lawyer had. No, he just states, what he can say in a tactful way about why it's good that he's talking and presenting his case before Felix. Knowing that for many years you have been a judge of this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Now that was all true. Felix had been in charge over the Jewish people for a long time. He started as governor in 52. This is 58, so 6 years he's been over Judea. For 10 years before that, he was over Samaria. So he's been dealing with the Jews for 16 years. Now, if you're going to stand before somebody and explain a little bit about the attitude of the Jews towards Christians, he would be somebody that probably have some insight into that, right? He's been around for a long time. So he's heard a lot of cases before, seen a lot of things before among the Jews, and he knows their prejudices and so on. So that would be a positive thing, to present your case to some experienced governor rather than somebody that just showed up and doesn't know anything about these matters. So Paul said he's cheerful to have Felix be the one that judges these things. And again, humanly speaking, he could, all that Paul's got to rely on is the truthfulness of what he has to say, and he's going to set forth the self-evident truth that he is not the one that's caused this problem. In Luke 21:14 and 15, we're told that the Holy Spirit was with Paul. When he stands up and he offers this defense, and it's an excellent defense, he's got some divine help that it was promised to him to help him make the right arguments too. So make up your mind, Jesus said to the apostles, not to prepare beforehand to defend yourself, for I will give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or to refute. And Paul's going to have some wisdom in the things that he says in setting this forth. So, again, happy to make his defense before Felix. So, first charge is that he is a pest and he causes disturbances among the Jews. Remember that? Paul hadn't had time to do all of that, right? He's only been there for 12 days. And he wasn't engaged in any kind of stuff like that. Since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. So before he got arrested or sent up there he doesn't seem to count the 5 days he's been in jail. But before the time he got arrested where he couldn't do anything, right? If he's in jail, you know what, you see a lot of these murder shows and stuff where they have a real good suspect, they think, that's really got all the reasons to kill somebody or whatever, and then they find out they were in jail. So, well, we can strike that guy off. He was in jail that day, right? Paul only had 12 days where he wasn't in jail. That's what he's talking about. There's only been 12 days that he could have caused all this trouble. And with just a little investigation, he'd find out what really happened. Paul got there the first day. He came to Jerusalem in Acts 21:15. The second day he spent with James and the elders, giving them that contribution from the saints. Then he promised, to show that he wasn't anti-Jewish customs, that he took 6 days that he spent under the vow, when paying for the vow for those people that were under that Nazirite vow. 9 days, on the 9th day, the tumult broke out on the last day when Paul was offering the sacrifices and paying for the expenses. The 7th day of the vow is when Lysias came down there and arrested him. And then the 10th day, he went before the Sanhedrin, and they, Paul said he was a Pharisee, and they all started arguing with each other. So that he wasn't doing anything that day. The 11th day, the plot to take his life, where the 40 men were going to kill him, took place. On the 12th day, he traveled up. He traveled the 11th day all night, and then the next day, on the 12th day, he came to Caesarea. So where did he have time to cause all this trouble? Right? There wasn't any place in there where he was going to synagogues and stirring up the Jews or causing trouble in the temple. None of that. That first charge, you can write that charge off. He was there to worship, and it didn't have anything to do with causing any kind of public riot or disturbance. It was the Jews from Asia that falsely accused him that caused the riot. It wasn't Paul. Verses 12 and 13, it says, "And neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself, did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot." It says here's the high priest and the members of the council. They didn't mention any synagogue I ever caused any trouble in. They didn't mention me doing anything at the temple that was wrong. He didn't preach any public sermons out there to cause any problems. Nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. So this is just a bunch of accusations without any evidence. And you're innocent till you're proven guilty, right? So it says they haven't proven anything. They're just making charges. So can't find any activity that I've been involved in. No proof. So what should we do at this point? Shouldn't we just say, not guilty, you can go, Paul? That's what you would think would happen if it was an honest court. Say, well, no evidence, case dismissed. But this I admit to you, Paul says, that according to the way, he charged him of being the ringleader of the Nazarenes, right? And he says, now I'm guilty of practicing the way. They call it a sect, but what it actually is the way. It's not a sect of anything. It is the way that God wants us all to go. That's what I preach. The way that God says we should go. The way to heaven, that's the way. It says, but according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers. Now that's the truth. And Paul's happy to preach a whole sermon on that if they want to hear it, right? He'd be happy. He's going to do it on other occasions. Tell you all about why it is the way that you should live. That Jesus is the way. And but it's not a sect. And we're not a sect. We don't want to be a sect. Just a part of something. We want to be a part of the faith. We want to be in the way that Jesus gave. And so Paul serves the God of our fathers. He serves the God of Israel. The word serve there, to serve, to minister to, either to a god or men, and used alike of slaves and free men in the New Testament to render religious service or homage to worship. So Paul worships and serves the God of Israel. That's the God he serves. Christianity isn't a offshoot of anything. It is the fulfillment of Judaism, right? That's what Paul taught everywhere. This was all foretold back there in the Old Testament that it was coming. Jeremiah said there was going to be a new covenant, right? This isn't some sect. This is the real thing that God promised from the beginning. And that's the way I serve God. And so Paul's argument is, no, this isn't an illegal religion. This is what Judaism was teaching everybody to get ready for, right? That's what the gospel is. It's the offshoot of these things. Anybody else have a thought or a comment? Want to say something? I don't want to take all of the time up. Anybody want to add anything? All right, verse 15. Having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. He said, I have hope in God. That's what Paul's way is all about, is hoping in the salvation that God can give. And it includes a resurrection of the dead, of all of the dead. You see what a fundamental doctrine it is to believe that everybody's going to be raised from the dead? The Apostle Paul, he knows the gospel, doesn't he? And he says that's a fundamental thing. Both the wicked and the righteous will be raised on the last day. That is something that is God's will. It's going to happen. And so it's something that he brought up when he met together with them in that trial before the Sanhedrin, wasn't it? He said, I'm a Pharisee and I believe in the resurrection. And said, these men cherish that hope of a resurrection also. Now, not all of them. If they were Sadducees, they didn't, right? But some of the members of the council, the majority of the council was Pharisees. So evidently among these accusers of Paul, there's a lot of Pharisees that are there. And so he brings it up again. I'm on trial here for hoping in God about the resurrection of the dead. That's what this is about. I believe Jesus was raised from the dead, and that guarantees everybody else is going to be raised from the dead. So, it says, in view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience, both before God and before men. So Paul says about his own standard of morality and ethics that he lives, he judges everything in view of resurrection day. We're all going to be resurrected. We're all going to stand before God, and we're all going to have to give account for how we've lived our life. And since that is my view and my hope, I always try to keep a good conscience. I always try to do what I think is right all the time. And of course, that's what Christianity is all about. It's one of the fundamental things that we're all to practice, is to keep a good conscience. Always do what you think is right. Now, I know that just doing what you think is right isn't always mean you're right. But you've got to do what you think is right. And you need to be educating yourself all the time to make sure what you think is right is actually what God's Word says is right. But we have to try to keep a good conscience. So Paul lets them know, I am dedicated to being an honest person. I'm not out doing anything underhanded to cause trouble. I'm trying to practice what I can answer for on the day of judgment. And that should be the way we should be able to say also, that we live to try to keep our conscience blameless, where it won't accuse us, not before men or before God. So we care what other people think. We want people to understand we're living honestly, and they won't see that about us. But to be blameless in the sight of God, what does that require above what maybe men trying to impress them? You think about some distinction between those two? What can God do about your behavior and that men can't do? God knows all your motives, right? He knows all that you're thinking. So you got to be honest in everything that you even think about, right? To be right with God. So Paul is striving to be honest in every way. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. So one of the things that Paul was one of the reasons he came to Jerusalem was to bring alms. It had been several years since he'd been to Jerusalem before. At the end of the second missionary journey, he went to Jerusalem and then he went up to Antioch. It's been a number of years have passed, and he's come back after the third missionary journey. And here is where it mentions specifically that he brought a gift of charity, basically, right, for the needy in the church. All those Jewish Christians that were in need. So, where we read over there in Romans 15:25 and 1 Corinthians 16 about the collection for the saints and about how to gather up the collection and all of that. Here in the book of Acts we see where he talks about that. I brought alms to my people. That was one of my main purposes in coming to Jerusalem, was to come up here and bring a gift to the Jewish people and to present offerings of worship. And part of that is our giving is a pleasing sacrifice to God. And all of our religious service is an offering to God. So Paul has come up to do his religious duty and to give alms to the poor Christians, and had nothing to do with stirring up a riot or defiling the temple. It says, in which they found me occupied in the temple. I was there offering sacrifices at the time that I got arrested. He was doing at the temple exactly what you're supposed to do at the temple. He was carrying out religious service there to God. Having been purified without any crowd or uproar, but there were certain Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you and to make accusations if they have anything against me. It says, I was treating the temple the way the temple's supposed to be treated. I purified myself. I wasn't causing any disorder. And these Jews from Asia accused me. And they're not here. And that's the only people that really claim they saw me do anything wrong, they're not here. They all went, I guess they got out of town. They left. So the accusers aren't here. You know, in a just trial, you should be able to face your accusers, shouldn't you? And the accusers aren't even here. Everybody that's testified at this trial is second, third-hand information that they're trying Paul on. The eyewitnesses that should be here are not here. So he shows, certainly, they don't have any first-hand evidence at all that he defiled the temple. And this case, again, should be dismissed. So, got that chart twice there. Let's see. Verse 21, 22, or 20 and 21. It says, or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council, other than for this one statement which I shouted out while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead I am on trial before you today. So since we don't have the eyewitnesses, let the Jewish leaders tell what crime I committed. I stood before them. I had a trial before them. And the only thing there was any dispute about was I said that there's a resurrection from the dead. And they all, of course, I don't think they want to talk about that, do you? He went in there and said, I am a Pharisee and I believe in the resurrection, and they all started fighting with each other. That's how that day went. That's not a very flattering story to tell. I don't think they want to testify about that, but Paul brings it up. Says if they're willing to get up and tell you about that trial, they can do so. We just had a big controversy over that they don't even agree among themselves about that. That's all that they could get up and say anything about. So, again, I stand before you now. What's the verdict going to be? Well, you know, you'd like to hear, you can go. We've been studying about Jesus' trial on Wednesday nights and how Jesus was condemned by Pilate. And when you heard all that and they said, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, you think, well, Pilate would say, okay, you can go. But it didn't happen that way, did it? Justice was taken away. And in Paul's case, same thing. Should say, all right, you can go your way. You're not guilty. But Felix, having a more exact knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will decide your case. So Paul, it says Felix has been around for, 16 years among the Jews and Christians and all of this. He understands a lot more about the gospel and why the Jews don't like the gospel and why they oppose Jesus and all that. He understands all of that a lot more than Tertullus and these Jewish officials maybe give him credit for. He knows what this is really all about. This isn't about Paul defiling the temple or causing riots. That's not what this is about. This is a religious dispute, and that's what's going on here. And it's interesting to think, as some writers have pointed out, how did Felix get this greater, what did he know about the gospel? How did he know about the way? And there's a lot of ways he could have known about the way, just some of them to think about. Of course, the Romans have their spies. They're always investigating any group that they think might be seditious or anything. They would have an eye on Christians and churches and knowing what was going on. And Philip preached there for 20 years in Caesarea. So you got Philip, the evangelist, preaching there all the time. So maybe he's heard about what Philip preaches. Philip's Drusilla is Felix's wife. She's the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. So Drusilla would have known a lot about Christians, right? Her husband her father got struck dead because he had Peter be arrested and James beheaded. So she would have known something about it. And a lot of other preachers in Samaria and Judea that he could have come across over the years, that he knew a lot about Christianity and about the disputes. So he put them off. That's a legal term for he postponed the hearing. That's one way to go, isn't it? You can either give people justice and let's move on, or you can just go, well, we'll just carry this case over indefinitely is what's going to happen. For 2 years, and when he leaves, Paul's still in jail. Well, we'll have to come back.